People are leaving churches and Christianity in droves, and it is the church's fault. Buckle up. I'm going to give you some hard truths, and you might not want to hear them. Hi, I'm Jeremy. I'm a deep skeptic, also a pastor. There's historical context here. You know, I love a little bit of history, but I believe that the thing that is fueling all of these people leaving has its source in this progression of values that have shifted over the last 200 years in Christianity. So the model a long time ago, maybe even 300 years ago or a little more, that was this parish priest model. And that was that every community had a priest or a pastor that just tended to the spiritual needs of that community. They were there when they got married, when they died. They talked to people about God and spirituality, but it was all focused on that local little community. And they fulfilled this role of a pastor in that community. They helped people who, were in a hard time financially, all of those things, but at a very small, very community level. There was this expectation that their role was a role in the community and not this bigger CEO growth-focused role. And then, partly in response to real huge social issues and needs, the church started to expand that. You saw churches beginning to work towards opening hospitals. And then there was this massive movement of the Sunday school movement that helped kids learn school stuff, right? Like how to read and that kind of stuff when they weren't able to go to school because they were working, on their parents' farm or whatever. Those were incredible things. But again, I'm not a historian, but it begins to shift, I think, the church's focus away from this sort of parish priest model to becoming this larger organization that is sustaining these really big initiatives. Those initiatives are good. I don't want to say that, but it's an important shift, I think, in the mindset of the church. And then there's this new movement, the church growth movement, that moves the sort of expectations of what the pastor is about from just sort of being the spiritual person in a community to growing the church, right? It's all about church growth, how you grow your church, how you get more people to come to your church, and all of that. That comes to, I think, its ultimate culmination in the mega church movement that happened really, I think, in the late 90s, early 2000s, and in some ways in the 1980s. So the metric of success for a local church is now not just is the pastor filling the needs of those local people, but are they growing in numbers? That then leads to a movement that is like, okay, what all can we do to attract more people? Can we have a soccer team? Can we have, we go on and on and on, and it increases this programmatic focus that ultimately is all about just adding more people to the church role. Those pastors and churches amass more and more power because of the larger and larger number of people that are coming to them and their ability to convince those people to join an organization. That then becomes attractive to political parties that are trying to do the same things, get people elected and have more and more people vote for them. And all of that sets the stage for the reasons that people are leaving in droves right now. So let me tell you a bunch of those reasons. One of the things that I don't think gets talked about enough is that all of this leads to worship being the most important thing that a church does, because that's the place where they add members and where they collect money to support this ever increasing, ever more expensive operation that they are doing. Now, the problem is that when you ask people to describe their most recent experience of church, either the answer is, I don't know, I can't remember what it was like, or the most popular one, it is boring. It's also the place where a lot of people experience all kinds of things like being manipulated out of money, right? This pressure to give and to give more and to sacrifice and do all of that. And this sort of pressure that this is the place where you experience God and that you have this spiritual experience where a lot of people, their primary way that they connect with God, the place that they feel God the most is not in a church worship service. So that's a huge reason that people are leaving the church. They're leaving the church not because they want to be entertained, but because they're going to church to try to find a spiritual community. And when they arrive, they get something that is boring in a place that they are asked over and over again to give more and more money. And that's justified by using Bible verses that actually don't say that you have to give 10% of your income to the church, even though churches will cherry pick those and use those as some verses that talk about 10% and to try to get people to give more and more money. But it's not just money and worship. People are looking for a place of love and grace and acceptance where they can feel like there is something that is helping them to fight the epidemic of loneliness in their lives. And oftentimes what they find at church is not that. What they find at church is a place where they have made theological claims that are not based in what biblical scholars say is sort of the academic consensus around the Bible. And they and their friends experience people telling them that they are going to hell because they are part of the LGBTQ community, or saying things that are just blatantly racist and endorse either explicitly or implicitly systemic racism and injustice. And then some of them send their kids, or they went to as kids, church camps and retreats where emotional manipulation is king, and they experience some of the worst parts of purity culture where they or their children are shamed for their bodies and the natural pieces of what it means to be a human in the world that is growing and is a sexual being and all of that. And then in many places, and I wish this wasn't a big deal, but in many places, they are also hearing anti-science perspectives that is treating the Bible as a science book and telling them that like evolution isn't a thing, and all kinds of other scientific insights into the brain and mental health, right? That's not a thing, that mental health is actually just demons operating. And then there is the fear, and people using this ancient spiritual text and complete misinterpretations of it to fuel fear on people to help get them more committed to the church. Things like the rapture. If you're not a Christian, at some point, all the faithful people will be taken away, and the unfaithful people and the non-Christians are going to really experience horrible natural disasters. Or this very wild doctrine of hell that says that for very small, finite mistakes that you make here in this mortal life, this finite existence, you will experience eternal conscious punishment. And in my experience, all of those things are directly or indirectly tied to this bigger value of growing churches and this history that brought us to this place. And that is the biggest piece. And that is the thing that I think may be hardest for churches to undo and unlearn. And the thing that churches need to unlearn is that they need to stop trying to grow their church and instead focus on meeting the spiritual and relational and emotional needs of their communities. And it's interesting because one of the things that people will say when you say this to them is like, yeah, and if you do that, you will grow your church. No, the purpose, the focus has to stop being on growing churches. Because if it's all a transaction to add people to the roles of the church, more and more people will continue to leave in droves. But if the church is able to fulfill its actual role in society and meet people's spiritual, relational, and emotional needs and help them find a purpose greater than themselves and do all of that kind of stuff, that is something that people actually need and want. And if we haven't completely lost our credibility, might even try to find that in a church.